So happy chameleon video of the day. Questions about chameleons? All right. Kelsey has the phrenosomatids.
Yep. So these are the spiny lizards, and there's 9 genera and 148 species. They're a diverse group. They're found in Panama to the extreme south of Canada. They're adapted to life in hot, sandy deserts, but prefer rocky deserts or even like forest edges. They're egg-laying and a viviparous species, with the latter being more common at higher elevations. So like that.
Okay. These are your typical North American lizards. This is Texas spiny lizard, Scalopus olivacea. And the reason that they're called spiny lizards is because the free edges of the scales often tend to poke up, giving them this kind of spiny appearance when you see them in profile. They generally look rough-skinned as opposed to the granular scales that you see on the Teiids, for example, which you will oftentimes find phrenosomatids and Teiids in the same environments, but they look very different from one another. These are some examples of them. The horned lizard that we talked about back in Bio 133 is one example of them. The fence lizard that we have here in the Midwest and into the western parts of the United States is one of them. This is actually a spiny lizard. This is one of the earless lizards. It's an earless lizard because it doesn't have external ear openings. It's one of the few groups of the spiny lizards that doesn't tend to have spiny scales. They're spiny along the tail, but they're more granular on the body. And so this is kind of one of the exceptions to the general rule that these things have scales with free edges that poke up. You'll also notice on the horned lizard that there are certain scales on its body that have the free edges poking up, but then on the dorsal surface of the body, you'll often find a lot of granular scales as well. We have one example of a horned lizard in the collection upstairs, and you'll see the contrast on a single individual between spiny scales on some regions of the body and granular scales on other regions of the body, as opposed to members of the genus Scalopus, like the fence lizard and the Texas spiny lizard, where all of those scales across the entire body are, for the most part, spiny scales with the free edge sticking up. Yeah, and they're not just found in dry areas. When you get down into the tropics, you find them in other places other than arid regions. But certainly in our area, they tend to be found more in arid regions than not. The eastern spiny lizard goes all the way into the mesic forests of the southeastern United States. But that's really the only species of this group that is distributed in the east, if I'm recalling correctly. All right, the iguanidae. Keep in mind that the iguanidae used to include the Crotophytidae, the Dactyloidae, the Iguanidae, the Phrenosomatidae. All of those used to be in this big superfamily Iguanidae that has now been divided up into, for example, the Phrenosomatidae, and formerly the Iguanidae, which is now a much smaller taxonomic grouping than it used to be. Who has the Iguanidae?
I do.
Oh, Quinn, go for it.
So they are large in size. They're primarily herbivorous. They are found in South America. There aren't any species that are native to this area. And then there are 3 neurotropical species that are descendants of animals that were imported as pets.
Okay, so these are the things that you normally think of as iguanas. This is a common iguana. The species is iguana. This is a picture I took of an iguana hanging out at one of the forts in San Juan, Puerto Rico. It's introduced in Puerto Rico. All of these species are relatively large. This is one of the larger rock iguanas. They tend to be the kinds of lizards that make over ocean voyages fairly often, such that they end up in places like Fiji and Tonga and the Galapagos and on the islands of the Caribbean. And once they're there, they have in many cases evolved into endemic species. Who can remind me what we mean when we talk about endemism? What do we mean when we talk about an endemic species?
I think it's like when a species is native only to one area.
Yeah, that's
and
exactly.
It's not found elsewhere.
Yep, it's a species that is limited in its distribution to one particular area. And so one of the tricky things about the word endemism or using the term endemic species is that, for example, the Mona rock iguana is endemic to an island off the coast of Puerto Rico, in between Puerto Rico and Hispaniola. And so it's endemic to that one island. But for example, human beings are endemic to planet Earth. We have a limited distribution. Our limited distribution is planet Earth. We don't have humans on Mars or the moon or Saturn or Jupiter or any of the moons of Jupiter. So endemism is a weird term because it could be referred to humans because humans are endemic to planet Earth. But generally when we use it, it's usually to be referred to animals that have a small and limited distribution. So for example, Scalopris undulatus, which is the eastern fence lizard, is endemic to North America, but it has an amazingly wide distribution on a continent. Now it's not found on any of the other continents, and so it technically is endemic, but we don't usually use that term to describe it because even though it is endemic to North America, it has a broad geographic range within that, as opposed to, for example, some of the plethodonid salamanders that are, for example, endemic to the Edwards Plateau region of Texas, for example. So endemism is a tricky term. You just need to, be careful the way you use it and the way you see other people use it as well. But a lot of these species are truly endemic in that they're, for example, only found on one particular island in some archipelago somewhere. That's true with many of the species of Cyclura throughout the Caribbean. Did you mention whether these lay eggs or not, Quinn?
I did not, and I do not.
And you what?
I'm not sure.
Okay, these are all egg-laying species, so none of these are viviparous. All right, and then Paul has the Dactyloidea. Or Dactyloideae, rather. The Dactyloideae are the anoles. There's one genus now. This used to be in a large group of lizards that included a number of different genera, but once again, they've been divided up. What used to be considered anoles are now found in two families, the Dactyloideae and the Polycrotidae. So one genus, but it's a very speciose genus, 391 species. These are mostly small. They generally lay a single egg. One of the things that we've revisited a couple of times now is the fact that there are some groups where reproduction is invariant. So for example, in the geckos, we see that they either lay one or two eggs. And in the Dactyloideae, they lay a single egg. And one of the things that you find with these reduced reproductive lizards is they tend to be arboreal or they tend to be fossorial. Those are the two kinds of morphotypes or kind of lifestyles that lead to this severe reduction in reproduction. And turns out that anoles and geckos, both of which are either arboreal or scansorial for the most part, tend to exhibit this reduction in reproduction. Because they are arboreal or scansorial, they also have toe lamellae, although the structure of the toe lamellae is different. This is once again a convergent characteristic. And then these guys have a dewlap. The males have a flap of skin under their neck, and they have a modification once again of the hyoid bone that they can extend that thing out and display the color that is on this flap of skin. And that overall structure is called a dewlap. And I think I have a video that shows this. This is one of the groups that has tended to undergo repeated adaptive radiation. And so what you generally find is on any island in the Caribbean, for example, you will find that there's a radiation of anoles, and they are all most closely related to one another, but they have the same kind of repeated morphotypes on each island. So if you go to Cuba, or if you go to Hispaniola, or if you go to Puerto Rico, you're going to find a trunk anole, you're going to find a twig anole, you're going to find a trunk crown anole, and you're going to find a crown giant. And they're all going to look very similar to the crown giants, for example. The crown giant on Cuba looks very similar to the crown giant on Hispaniola, and that looks very similar to the crown giant on Puerto Rico. But in reality, these crown giants on each island are more closely related to the other species of lizard on that island than they are to the crown giants on adjacent islands. So in each of these cases, one anole species arrived on an island, diversified into these various different morphotypes, and that happened on Cuba, it happened on Hispaniola, it happened on Puerto Rico, it happened on Vieques to a certain degree, which is a smaller island off the coast of Puerto Rico. So for example, where I've worked in Puerto Rico, this is the trunk anole, this is the twig anole that occurs up in the canopy. This is kind of a trunk crown anole. This is Anolis evermanni. This is Anolis krugi, which is a grass anole. And in the long time that I worked in Puerto Rico, I found one crown giant. All of these are really, really small, and this is a very large anole. And so we have the grass bush anole, we have the trunk anole, we have the twig anole, we have the trunk crown anole, and then we have the crown giant. And I've basically seen all of those at one time or another in Puerto Rico. These species are all more closely related to one another than the trunk anole on Puerto Rico is related to the trunk anole on Hispaniola. And we'll actually read a paper later in the semester about this repeated adaptive radiation, if I recall correctly. Yeah, so here is a picture of common anole, the Anolis carolinensis, which is the one that gets into the southeastern United States. And you can see that this is the dewlap. In this case, the dewlap is red in coloration, and it's uniformly red. Those little white spots are actually just the scales. The dewlap color varies from species to species and is oftentimes important in distinguishing species from one another, as well as the ground color as well, but the dewlap color is also important. And males use this dewlap in two contexts. One context is in male-male contests when they're competing for access to territorial space. And then the other place in which they use this is in mating displays to attract a female anole for the purpose of mating. And this is something that you will oftentimes see in animal behavior, is that the same signal, in this case, the extension of the dewlap, that signal has multiple purposes. In this case, one purpose is to essentially use this signal in territory defense, and in another case is used as a mating signal to the female. This is oftentimes combined with push-up motions, where the animal is basically raising its body up on its forelegs and sometimes its forelegs and hind legs in a rhythmic pattern that calls attention not only to itself, but also to the presence of the dewlap by moving that dewlap around in three-dimensional space. Questions about anoles. One of the most studied groups of lizards in the world, and Anolis carolinensis has become something of a model organism because it's one of the few lizards that has a complete genome that has been constructed for it. It's been sequenced for it. All right, who has the Crotophytidae? Is Kiara?
Yep. So they're moderately large. They're diurnal. Some habit mesic and arid areas, flatland deserts, and rock-dwelling areas. And they eat insects and some vertebrates, but other lizards can eat actually other lizards and rodents and snakes. Predation is aided by the large jaw adductor muscles, and they use squealing vocalizations when stressed, and they are all oviparous.
Okay. They're also bipedal, which means that when they run, they will get up on their back legs. They'll lift their front legs off the surface of the ground and just propel themselves further forward on their back legs. As a result of that, they're amazingly fast and hard to catch at times. In the United States, we have both genera, Gambelia, which are oftentimes referred to as the leopard lizards, and Crotophytis, which are referred to as the collared lizards. And then they also differ, these two genera differ in terms of the ability to autotomize their tail. This is a collared lizard from the Wichita Mountains in south central Oklahoma. In this particular population, they have an unusual color pattern where they take on this kind of turquoisey green color with the yellow throats. This is a male and a female. You can see the collar on the animal. This is why they're called collared lizards. You can also see the very large head. This is a male and female interacting with one another, and you can see that the male is attempting to blow himself up and make himself appear bigger by inflating the loose folds around the bottom of the mouth and neck. This female is showing color. These orangish red spots on the side of the body are spots that develop in females when they're gravid, when they're carrying eggs. And so you can tell whether or not an individual is gravid in many cases by just looking at her. Once again, these are, in my opinion, one of the prettiest colored lizards in North America because they have these vibrant green and turquoise bodies with these bright yellow heads. Other colored lizards tend more towards gray or brown, but once again, they will have colored, dark colored collars, and they also display color when the female is carrying eggs. This is the distribution of the Crotophytidae, so it's definitely a North American species limited to North America. You find them in Missouri, down in the Ozarks. There is one population down at Blue Springs Lake, but that is an introduced species. And you tend to find them in Ozarks only in glade habitats. Do you guys know what a glade is?
Not like a swampy area.
It is not a swampy area at all. It's just the opposite of a swampy area. Glades are generally hot, dry areas that are hot and dry because they are on the southwest faces of hills. And so on the southwest faces of hills, those tend to get the hottest sun of the day. And so when you find places where there's a lot of exposed rock on southwest facing hillsides, you will find habitats that are suitable for Crotophytis in Missouri. Let's go to Google Earth real quick. Can you guys see Google Earth? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
We don't need Procalpa right now. We're going to zoom over to Liberty. We're going to stop Liberty. We're going to go and visit this area of Kansas City on one of our field trips once the weather clears up. We're going to go down 435, and we're going to get to this section of town, which is called Swope Park, and we're going to go down past the golf course in Swope Park. And when you go down Blue River Parkway, Blue River Road here, you will find that there are, on the southern facing hillsides, there are areas where you see that there are relatively sparse trees, and you can see a lot of exposed rock in these areas. And these little fragments are some of the few places where you'll be able to find collared lizards anymore in the Kansas City area. And as these places have been overrun by invasive species like bush honeysuckle that tend to fill in the understory and shade these areas out, making them cooler and moister, you've seen collared lizards and scorpions and centipedes and things like this that were limited to these glade environments. You've seen them disappear. So this is a place called Blue River Glade. It's undergone a lot of restoration on the first glade here and the second glade here. But as you can see, as you get further out in this glade complex, this one is much more cluttered up with bush honeysuckle. As a result, it's cooler and moister, and it looks very different in terms of its vegetation and the animals that occur there, as opposed to these two sections of glade right here. Even if you go down into the Ozarks, you don't find collared lizards uniformly in the Ozarks. So let's zoom out and go down to Springfield. Actually, let's go all the way down to Branson. So in the Branson area, you will find collared lizards, but you're not going to find them in areas that are mainly forested. You're going to find them in these glade areas where the vegetation is actually less sparse. This is a big glade, the Henning Conservation Area. And this is an area that doesn't have a ton of trees. It's very open, very grassy. And you will find collared lizards in here, but you won't find them in the more densely forested areas that are adjacent to this glade complex. And so they're very specific in this part of the country. Go down into Texas, where it's just generally hotter and drier, and you can find collared lizards just about anywhere. But here in Missouri, they really are limited to glade complexes. Here in the Kansas City area, there is an introduced population, which we may or may not go and visit. Yeah, we'll probably go and visit it because there are other things to do down there. If we go down to south of I-70, there is a lake, a couple of lakes actually. There's Blue Springs Lake. If you go to Blue Springs Lake, you can see that the dam is basically made up of, it's an earthen dam, and it's covered in a lot of boulders to hold the soil in place. And if you go walking around these boulders, you will see collared lizards poking their heads up. And this is an introduced species. Probably somebody's pet was released and founded this colony. In past years, I've gone with students and visited this dam and the adjacent quarry. This is an old quarry site. And up on this hillside, you can actually find quite a few interesting amphibians and reptiles early in the spring. And if it's warm enough, if it warms up enough, we'll see collared lizards down on the dam. So that's one of the field trips that we will take. Questions about the Crotophytidae? All right, let's see who's next. Oh, that's it for lizards. Yay! So I will introduce the snakes. Snakes are also members of the Squamata, but they're a monophyletic clade within the Squamata. They lack the scleral ossicles, these bones that go around the eye that are found in lizards. They tend to have more kinetic skulls, more loosely articulated skulls. This is one of the things that enables them to swallow their prey whole. Of course, one of the reasons that snakes have to swallow their prey whole is because they don't have any arms and legs with which to handle prey, because they are limbless. They have lots of precloacal vertebrae. One of the things that makes them elongate is the number of vertebrae. The number of vertebrae can vary within species as well as among species. And it's been found that at least in some groups, the vertebral number is actually underlain by significant amounts of genetic variation, such that there are actually genes that control the number of vertebrae that you have. Autotomy is very rare, and when it does occur is intervertebral, which means that when the tail breaks off, it is not capable of regenerating. They have a modified pleurodont tooth attachment. Once again, the pleurodont teeth are the ones that they're mounted on the inner surface, the sloping inner surface of the jaw. And then you can separate different groups of snakes in some cases by whether or not they have enlarged teeth, which are referred to as fangs, that are located on the maxilla. And so this tooth arrangement is referred to as either Apistoglyph, Proteroglyph, or Selenoglyph, depending upon where on the maxillary bone the fang is located and whether or not it's an articulated tooth or not. And I think the next slide gets into this. Yeah. So here is the skull of a lizard. You can see the scleral ossicles. You can see that there's a lot of fusion of the bones of the skull, as opposed to when you look at a snake skull, you see that the skull is more loosely articulated. There are lots of gaps between the bones, and even the articulations of the bones are capable of coming apart, and they stay connected through connective tissue, but they're not fused with sutures like these bones are. They're actually articulated. This then makes it able for those bones to disarticulate. So when they go to swallow whole prey items, the bones of their skull separate apart to increase the size of the opening for getting food in. Important to pay attention to the maxillary bone here, because the maxillary bone is where the fangs are located. And the question for you when you look at fang structure is it located at the front of the mouth or the rear of the mouth? And when it's located at the front of the mouth, is it a fixed fang or is it a flexible hinged fang that is retractable? Does it stick down all the time, or does it fold up against the roof of the mouth when the mouth is closed? So this is the Apistoglyph arrangement. This is a situation where there's a single large fang on the rear portion of the maxillary bone. You see that the rest of the bone is relatively devoid of teeth. And this gland is this salivary gland called the Devournois gland is the venom gland that is associated with this fang. Apistoglyph snakes are the snakes that we generally refer to as rear-fanged snakes because of the position of the fang. So in the United States, these would be snakes in the family Dipsadidae, which we'll get to later. It used to be the family Colubridae, and we used to refer to these as rear-fanged colubrids, but they've been pulled out of the Colubridae and placed in their own family. Then we have Proteroglyph snakes and Selenoglyph snakes. The Proteroglyph snakes are snakes with a frontal fang, as are the Selenoglyph snakes. But in the Proteroglyph snakes, the fang is in the front and it's fixed. It's always projecting downward. In the Selenoglyph snakes, the fang is attached to a part of the maxilla that has basically become articulated, such that when the mouth of the animal is closed, this fang folds up against the upper surface of the roof of the mouth. And when the snake extends its gape in order to strike at something, that fang basically flips out and projects forward, and then is retracted as the mouth of the snake closes. So Proteroglyph and Selenoglyph both are in the front of the mouth. Proteroglyph is fixed, and generally they're also shorter as a result of that. The Selenoglyph are hinged, and as a result of that, you can fit a much larger fang inside of the mouth of the snake because it's not constantly projecting. Proteroglyph is found in the elapids, the coral snakes and cobras, and also in the sea snakes. And then the Selenoglyph are found in the vipers, the family Viperidae. So the fang arrangement is also important taxonomically in terms of these are synapomorphies, derived characters that are in these monophyletic groups. So the groups that we need to be worried about are the elapids, the colubrids, the viperids, pythons and boas, simply because we do have a couple of boid species and they're unique in some ways. The Typhopny and the Leptor Typhopny, these are the blind snakes. These are the snakes that we mainly need to be worried about because they are in North America. Pythons and boas, we have a native boas, two native boid species, and then we have a bunch of python species that are introduced into southern Florida and are causing ecological problems there. So who has the Leptor Typhopny? Oh no, who has the, wait, I went out of order. Okay, so who has the Leptor Typhopny? Nobody has the Leptor Typhopny. How did I miss assigning them to someone? I guess that means I have the Leptor Typhopny. So Leptor Typhopny are sometimes referred to as blind snakes or thread snakes. They are tiny. They're very, very slender. They're very, very shiny. People oftentimes mistaken them for earthworms. So if you flip a rock and you see something there, people who are untrained will oftentimes think that they're just looking at an earthworm. They tend to have very, very small mouths, and they tend to feed on soft-bodied prey, things like termites. Sometimes they can be ant specialists, and this particular group of species has undergone a lot of taxonomic change. So Reynadulsis, which is a species that used to be in the genus Leptotyphlops, dulcis used to be the species name as an ant specialist that occurs here in the United States. Reynadulsis have the ability to follow ant trails using scent cues, the same scent cues that the ants use, and they will actually go down into ant colonies, and they're capable of secreting a secretion that mimics the pheromones that ants themselves use to communicate with other members of their colony. One of the things about ants is that the way an ant knows if another ant is a member of its colony is by pheromone cues. So ants learn what other members of their colony smell like, and if an ant goes into a colony that it doesn't belong to, the ants that exist there will sense that, and they will basically attack and pick up that ant and take that ant to the surface and throw that ant out of the colony. But these ant specializing snakes have the ability to mimic those secretions, and they can go down into ant colonies and live there and basically eat the larvae of the ants down in the nurseries in the ant colony. And they don't get kicked out because they are effective enough at mimicking those pheromones that they're not recognized as a predatory snake. They're recognized as just another ant in the colony. And you will see that when Reynadulsis comes into contact with an ant colony, the first thing that happens to it is that it gets attacked. And as it gets attacked, it will rise up into a ball. And as it rises up into a ball, you will see an excretion come out of the cloaca of the snake. And as the snake is writhing around, it's basically taking that secretion and spreading it all over its body. And once it is sufficiently coated in that secretion, you will notice that over the next couple of minutes, the ants will start leaving the snake alone and then just going back to doing whatever they were doing. And then at that point, the snake is free to navigate through the colony without being harassed. Another interesting thing that happens with these guys, it turns out that cavity nesting owls will oftentimes find blind snakes, Reynadulsis, pick them up and bring them back to their tree cavity, but they're not bringing them back to feed to their baby owls. They bring them back and they deposit them in the cavity of the owl, and then they live there as a commensal of the owl, and they feed on things like ants that are there that have the potential to attack and harass the developing owlets as they're developing. And so in an owl cavity, you will find the mama owl, the baby owls, and a blind snake in there eating parasites and ants and things like that. So a pretty interesting group. And maybe the reason I didn't give you Leptor Typhopny is because I wanted to do them myself, perhaps. All right. So this is what they look like. If you look carefully at a blind snake, you can see that the head end looks very different from the tail, or it looks very similar to the tail end. The only thing that you can see that makes them different is that you can usually see the eyes. In many cases, the eyes are reduced and they're found under a transparent scale that looks not like a modified spectacle. It just looks like a surface scale. But you can definitely see the scalation on these things, which tells you immediately that this is not an earthworm. It is actually a small, slender snake. And once again, in the United States, they're found in the desert Southwest regions for the most part. Talk to us about Boas and Pythons, Elizabeth.
So boas have some of the heaviest snakes, the heaviest extant snake, which is the green anaconda. They have the labial infrared sensors, as well as pelvic spurs in males that are used to grasp the females while mating. They can live in a variety of habitats and have a varied diet, from mammals to birds to other reptiles, and then salamanders and frogs. And in boas, viviparity is the ancestral condition. So only 3 species are oviparous, and 1 species, the boa constrictor, can reproduce parthenogenetically. Yeah, and then
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to go on to the pythons.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, did you look up anything about the pythons? Because I don't have a slide for the pythons actually.
So for the pythons, they have the longest extant snake, which is the reticulated python. They also have the infrared sensors, but they're located in pits between the labial scales. They also have pelvic spurs. They're oviparous and can make different kinds of nests out of leaves or using their own body, or they can lay their eggs in burrows. Their diet can consist of large vertebrates as well as humans. And then in between their feedings, they have a downregulated metabolism where the digestive organs and heart will decrease in mass. And then after they feed, there will be regrowth of the digestive tract tissues to digest their meal.
Did you read the paper about that?
No, I just read it in the textbook. It was
Okay,
crazy
yeah.
though. Like,
Yeah, so there's a lab group at the University of Texas at Arlington, which is where I was a PhD student. And this is stuff that's done by faculty here or there now that weren't there when I was a student, but some really good molecular biologists who study snakes, among other things. And they did this Rna-Seq study. You guys know what Rna-Seq is? Who can tell me what Rna-Seq is? Should remember this at least from genetics.
I think it's when they use, like, they track the mRNA levels to determine like which genes are being upregulated.
That is
Which
exactly what
means, yeah.
Rna-Seq is. So in Rna-Seq, what you do is you extract messenger RNA. Because messenger RNA degrades really quickly, the first thing you have to do after you've isolated is you have to very quickly use reverse transcription to transcribe it into cDNA. And then you can use that cDNA, which is much more stable. You can sequence that and then relate it back to the genes that basically coded for the RNA. And because messenger RNA is what you use, is this transcribed version of the genes, when you have a cell that is responding to something, it tends to upregulate those genes that are involved in that response. And so you can look at levels of gene expression by basically looking at how much messenger RNA has been produced at a particular time. And so they did this study with pythons where they looked at gene expression in the gut of pythons using Rna-Seq to see what kind of genetic changes are happening while the animal is going through these protracted periods of starvation in between eating these really large meals. So what pythons tend to do is they tend to eat a really large prey item and then not eat for in some cases periods of months at a time, and then they eat another large meal. And it turns out that gene regulation, the genes that are being transcribed and how much each gene is being transcribed is very different in the feeding phase versus in this phase of stasis when the animal is basically fasting between these really large meals. And they use gene expression to effectively build up the endothelial lining of the gut during periods when they're feeding, and then they let that atrophy completely when they're not feeding. And they can do this over a very short period of time. And when you look at the Rna-Seq profile of a fasting python versus a non-fasting python, they're totally different in terms of which genes are turned on and how much they're turned on. That's a guy named Todd Casto, who's at University of Texas at Arlington. He and his graduate students worked this out. It's some of the cooler molecular biology and herpetology I've seen in a while. Do you want to say anything about introduced species in Florida?
I can a little bit. So
Okay.
I know it's mostly caused by people just releasing their pet snakes and
Yep.
like pet trade into Florida. And then they really disrupt the ecosystem there because they don't really have any like natural predators, and they can grow really large really fast. And so then they're disrupting, like, I know in the Florida Everglades, especially because they can't really, like, the alligators can't really compete with them.
Yep.
On top
Yeah,
of like
so, so as soon as a snake gets big enough that you don't want to have it in your house anymore, people just let them go out in the wild, and at that point they're pretty big, and so they eat native animals because they become like one of the largest predators on the landscape at the time. There are actually a couple of reality shows that follow guys who go out in the Everglades hunting these pythons. There's actually a bounty on pythons, and so you get paid by the length and the weight of the snake. So you make more money by capturing bigger and bigger pythons. And some of these pythons are actually quite large. I keep telling my partner that when I retire, we should go and live in Florida, and I'll just open up an animal control business where I remove nuisance reptiles from people's backyards, because evidently you can make a decent living doing that in southern Florida. What are the native boas here in the United States, Elizabeth?
I want to say the rosy boa. I don't know the other one.
You would want to say the rosy boa because that's absolutely correct. And the other one is the rubber boa. And actually, they have a picture of the rubber boa right here under D. And the rubber boa lives in the Pacific Northwest and down the Sierras throughout California into Southern California. And actually over into the Rockies and the Bitterroots in Idaho as well. And then the rosy boa tends to be just limited to Southern California, Southern Arizona. But we have 2 species here in the United States. And that is the end of our time for today. So we will cover the colubrity, the dipsadidae, the natricity. So Kelsey and Quinn, if you want to look at the slides that I prepared for the dipsadidae and the natricity, that might help you some. But in the book, they're referred to as the subfamily Dipsadidae and Natricinae. And so that's the material that's in the book. And we'll hopefully finish up the reptiles on Monday, and I'll handle the alligators and the turtles and tortoises myself if you guys can finish working through the snakes. Questions? All right. Enjoy your weekend, and I will see you on Monday.